All right. Hello, everyone. I want to wish everyone a good day. And thank you for joining us for today's Client Enrichment Series presentation on RWA policy and process fundamentals. My name is Eric Fulton. I am the National Program Manager for Customer Outreach and Communication based out of GSA's headquarters office in Washington, D.C. More importantly, I'm excited to be your host today for the Client Enrichment Series. Today's presentation will be led by Laura Beth Hawkins and Paige Klunk, both of whom are program analysts with the Reimbursable Services Center for Customer Delivery in the Office of Project Delivery. And if you're keeping score at home, that's in our Office of Design and Construction for the Public Buildings Service at the General Services Administration. I do want to introduce our two presenters today. Paige works to improve the policy process, outreach, and systems components of the Reimbursable Services Program. She's a 2011 graduate of Gettysburg College with a degree in Music and Africana Studies. And she also completed a dual master's degrees from Ohio University in Public Administration and International Development Studies, and that was in 2017. Prior to GSA, Paige served for 2 years as an AmeriCorps Vista, fighting food insecurity in Southeast Ohio. So welcome, Paige. Now, Laura Beth started her career with GSA in 2004, beginning with our Region 6 Finance Office, where she handled the formation and execution of the reimbursable budget. It was at this time that she joined and then helped create the RWA national team in developing the program into that it is today. So we are in good hands with our presenters. Today, Paige and Laura Beth are going to spend some time taking a deep dive into RWA policy and process fundamentals. So the RWA stands for Reimbursable Work Authorization. It is a foundational element of PBS's Reimbursable Services Program. This multi-billion-dollar program supports the federal community with myriad of above standard critical projects and services. Well, what does above standard mean? I don't want to spoil the presentation for you today too much. We're going to get into that, but let's just say there's the rent you pay, and then there is a whole world of services that you can pay for outside of that rent. We're going to learn a little bit more about that in just a few moments. Before I turn the presentation on over to our hosts, I do want to go over just a few housekeeping instructions here. We have automatically muted your audio, and that is to help us control the sound quality of the presentation, but I'll tell you in a few minutes how you can interact with our presenters today. Zoom does offer closed captioning, so if you would like to take advantage of that, you will have to turn on the service yourself. You can find that depending on how your screen is configured at the bottom of your screen as a button, or by clicking the 3 dots for more, and it should pop up with a caption option. Zoom also allows you to customize your visual experience. You can expand and contract the size of the screen during presentation mode. You can also expand and contract the size of the various pods, and I want to talk about 2 of the pods that we'll be using today. We're going to be using today the chat pod and the Q&A pod for 2 completely different reasons. If you have a question about RWAs, a question for our presenters on the subject matter at hand, that is what the Q&A pod is for. You can put your questions into that Q&A pod. We have a group of RWA experts working behind the scenes that can turn around answers to those questions, but only if your RWA and reimbursable services questions are in the Q&A pod. There is also a chat pod. We are using that today if you need to get in touch with a technical question, if you're having trouble with the experience of Zoom, if you can't hear well or something is interrupting your webinar experience, you can reach a member of our team in the chat pod. So RWA questions Q&A pod, technical difficulties, compliments, complaints in the chat pod, and we will be able to sort that out. Again, I did say we do have RWA experts manning and womanning the chat pod, the Q&A pod. And what they will do is answer questions as they come in. And any questions that we don't get to by the end of this session, we are going to turn around with the ones we did answer and put them into a formal FAQ document, which we will make available to you after the session is over. We will also be posting those to our CES website, www.gsa.gov/CES. It's the same website you used to register for this session today. Once again, I want to thank you all for attending. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters in just a short second, but we do have 2 poll questions to help us get to know you a little bit better. And they're going to pop up on the screen. Sometimes if you are joining on a browser, you can't interact with the poll questions. So I'm going to read them out. And if you want to put your response in the chat, you can go right ahead and do that. The first is, which of the following roles best describes your involvement with RWA process? And you can select all that apply if multiple apply to you. Are you maybe a project manager, contracting officer? Are you a building, property, or portfolio manager? You a budget or financial manager? Are you a funding certifying official, or are you me, which is other? You can clarify what your position is there. So we are interested to know your role in interacting with us here at GSA PBS. I'll give everyone a moment or two to go through. And again, if you are unable to see or use the pop-up that's on my screen, you can go ahead and respond in the chat, and we're taking a look at that as well. All right, a few moments have passed. I think, can we see the results if I get a drum roll virtually here? All right, oh, what a great mix of people that we have here. We have about 1/3 who are project managers of some type, but then we have 18% who are contracting officers. Then we have another 18% who are in that building, property, facility, portfolio manager realm, 15% who are budget finance manager. And we do have 7% who are those fund certifying officials. I believe we will have some information specific to this crew coming up later in the session. And then a good chunk, 25%, with me identifying as other. So we have one more question that we want to get to before we move along. This one, if you have taken our eReader Digest class, will be familiar to you. We want to know if you currently do have eReader access. If you don't know what eReader is, you are going to find out in probably the next 10 to 15 minutes here. But we want to know, are you a data entry user? Are you a read-only user? Or do you not have eReader? Are you not an eReader user? Give everybody just another moment or two to contemplate what type of access they have. Maybe you're logging into the system right now to see if it tells you because you have forgotten. All right, let's see what the survey says here today. Oh, look at that. Okay, so we do have over half the people in this session are data entry users. That's fabulous. I don't want to assume, but maybe you've taken one of our eReader presentations before. We have another 17% who are read-only users, and that leaves about 1/3 of folks, the 31%, who don't have an eReader user ID. And I'll tell you, there's no shame in that game, because this is not specifically about eReader. This is about the RWA process, the policy and the fundamentals. But at the end of this, you might be so compelled to get yourself some eReader access. So I want to thank our poll wizards for putting that up. And with that, we have gotten to know each other a little bit better. I am going to step back, and I am going to turn the presentation on over to our first presenter, who is Paige. And so, Paige, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Eric. We're going to go ahead and get started today. I'm excited, along with the other members of the Reimbursable Services National Team, to take you on a journey into RWA world. So some of the topics that we'll be covering today are understanding RWAs, the RWA basics. You're going to come out of here fresh knowing the rules and how they affect your RWA, you as the customer. We're going to discuss appropriations law, RWA national policy, and that includes the NPM, the National Policy Manual, which we're here really excited about. We're going to be turning out a new version of the RWA Policy Manual in just a few weeks to a month. We're going to discuss project and process, eReader access. What is eReader and how do you get access? We're going to talk about the differences between the work request and the RWA. What really is the difference? We're also going to talk about requirements development and what role you play in that as the customer. We're going to talk about estimates, intake and submission, amendments, and of course, one of the most sought out of pieces of information, the end of year deadlines. And finally, we're going to leave you with where you can go looking for resources, contacts that you may need regionally, should you have any RWA policy questions, or if you're trying to implement a project, questions you may have about the process, your RWA managers and other resources we have available on the internet. So RWA basics, let's get started. A reimbursable work authorization, or RWA, is an agreement between GSA and a customer where GSA agrees to provide materials and services or services outside of normal rent. And the customer agrees to reimburse GSA's costs. Okay, you can read what's on the slide in front of you, but what does that mean? Let's break it down. What it means is it's very similar to a contract. So when acquisition will contract with a vendor to do the work, the vendor bills GSA, and then GSA pays that vendor, but then you in turn pay GSA for that work. So it's a contract, right? The Office of Management and Budget accepts the RWA Form 2957, which is the official contract that is created between you, the customer, and us, GSA. And all of that's done electronically, submitted via e-RETA. And it becomes GSA's formal interagency agreement with you, the customer. Just like I said before, it's very similar to a contract, and we at GSA have to do our due diligence to ensure that all the proper documentation is available. Part of the due diligence is actually signatory authority. Each region designates certain folks or people who sign RWAs on behalf of GSA. We'll get into that a little bit later, more. Funding authority. Funding authority guides everything that we do here at PBS. And these are some of the specific funding authorities that we work under as the Reimbursable Services Program. So the first is the Federal Buildings Fund, 40 U.S.C. 592B. This is pretty straightforward, and we say GSA can do work in our buildings and for our tenants. So it gives GSA the authority to do work in our within our jurisdiction, custody, and control for the customer. So for example, we, GSA, own the building and your agency rents space from us. Your agency wants to put in a new carpet. So we're able to do the work in your office space because we own the building. We can do the work in your office space under this funding authority. So let's move on to the second one. Construction of buildings, 40 U.S.C. 583. This allows GSA to do work in other locations not under GSA's jurisdiction. However, it's only for new construction, repairs, and alterations, but it does not require re-obligation prior to the expiration date of the obligational authority of funds. So what does this mean? So for example, your agency rents a space from an outside company, and you would like the space to be repainted, and you would like GSA to do the painting work. So under this budget authority, we, GSA, can come in and do the painting for you, even though you rent the space from another entity that's outside of GSA's jurisdiction. And finally, the third one, the Economy Act, 31 U.S.C. 1535, re-obligate in the same period as the RWA obligation. This means that both the requesting and performing agency to obligate provided funds within the period of funding appropriation availability. So, for example, if the customer sends in an RWA now and you use annual funds, GSA PBS shall turn it around and obligate money back out by September 30th. Another example, if the customer uses multi-year funds and it doesn't expire till next fiscal year, we have until the end of next fiscal year, September 30th, to obligate the funds back out. So those are the three types of funding authority that guide PBS to do the work that we do. They're all a little similar, but they're all a little different, but they have one thing in common. They should be recorded as obligations by the customer when the RWA is accepted, no matter what funding authority is used. So, but what's really good about this is that we as GSA are the experts in this field. So you don't actually have to know which funding authority that we use when you come in. Since we're the experts, you're able to come in and we can advise you on which funding authority we're able to do the work under. Now, for a pop quiz on funding authority, just kidding. As I said, we're the experts and we'll take care of the funding authority questions. Let's move on to timing. Let's move on to scope. So RWAs need to be detailed and specific. Let's talk about the first appropriations law that governs scope. 31 USC 1301, use of funds. You can't use funds for a different purpose. So this should be pretty straightforward. You can't use funds that have been authorized for one purpose for another. So for example, if Treasury gives your agency funds to replace windows, you can't replace carpet and you can't replace other things in your office. You must use those funds to replace the windows. So that's the use of funds. Funds can't be used for a different purpose. And the second is the purpose of appropriation. You need a clear scope. 31 USC 1501. You need a clear scope with a certain level of specificity. Well, what does that mean? Specificity? We like to use the phrase here in the reimbursable services program, intent, content, extent. Intent, content, extent. Let's break that down a little bit. So intent means the purpose. So let's take an example. The Social Security Administration is looking to renovate an office space to add additional workspace for an increase of 20 employees in one of their field offices. There's the intent. The intent of the work request is to renovate existing space to make it into an office space. Content. Look at the specifics of the scope. What are the specifics of the scope? We're looking for precise content. So back to our SSA example, we're looking at to take the wall down between two meeting rooms to convert it into a shared office space. We'll be adding new paint and fresh carpet upon the demolition of the walls, and then furnishing it with desks and chairs once all the work is complete. Content. That's the content of the RWA and the work that we will be doing. Finally, extent. What does that mean? The limitations by location, size, and others. So the location, back to our SSA example, the location where SSA's field office is housed with another agency in the same building. So the new office is physically limited to the 1,000 square foot meeting space that they're looking to convert into an office space. You're looking there at the square feet, the size, and the location being the limitation. So that's the extent. Intent, content, extent. So agencies must have authority to spend the money for the intended purposes. They must have documentary evidence to support obligation, a clear scope of work with a certain level of specificity. Okay, so now that we know about scope, let's move on to timing. RWAs have to be accepted at the right time. You can't get them too early and you can't get too late, as I'm sure we're all very aware of as attending this presentation. So the first is 31 USC 1502, bona fide need. No parking of money as the planning phase must be complete. So let's take an example. What does this mean? DEA post-COVID is looking to consolidate from 2 locations down into 1 with the return of workers to the office. So they're renovating the space to prepare the arrival of more employees. The services are being planned for fiscal year 24, but we have the bona fide need identified in fiscal year 23. So the work starts now in fiscal year 23. So the bona fide need has been identified in fiscal year 23. But also we can't accept the RWA too late, which means we get into the next one, which is 31 USC 1341, the Anti-Deficiency Act. We need the RWA first. We cannot write a contract for money we don't have. So let's use an example to illustrate this. So we're in the middle of a construction project and some unforeseen conditions have appeared during construction. But unfortunately, you don't have any extra funds or contingency because the project is very deep in and you've already used the little bit of contingency that you had set aside. So now in order to make up for the unforeseen conditions, you will need to process a change order, but you don't have any funds available to process the change order. What do? So now you need to secure more funds from your agency. And then once you have more documentation, which Laura Beth will get into a little bit later on, the statement of further written assurance, you will be able to proceed with your change order once you have the funding and the documentation. So once again, we can't do work for money that we don't have. So what does this mean for RWAs above TI allowance? RWAs must be accepted prior to lease award for the contract. Let's take another example. An agency is moving to a new location and you have costs above your TI allowance. We cannot have an award for the contract until we have an RWA for that work. If the contract is awarded prior to the RWA being accepted for the TI costs, both GSA and the customer would be anti-deficient without all construction money in hand. So just to reiterate, we cannot contract to do work without having funds obligated for the project. So next, we'd like to move on to the period of availability. The period of availability is really the limited time to deliver work and limitations on the change that you can make to the work as you're going through the project. So I'd like to actually skip to the next slide and give you a visualization of what this looks like. So let's use this chart to help explain the period of availability a little bit better. So let's pretend that we have a project for the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, that we're accepting here in fiscal year 23, and we have our bona fide need established. So IRS gets the RWA submitted to GSA in fiscal year 23. You see the red line at the end of fiscal year 23, at the end of year 0. What does this mean? This means that at the end of fiscal year 23, your scope is locked. You can't make any additional changes to the RWA or the scope beyond fiscal year 23. But you still have 5 years to liquidate the funds for the project. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You have until the end of fiscal year 28 when the appropriation is closed and you can liquidate all the funds. So just to reiterate, the period of availability for appropriations and changing the scope are locked at the end of year 0 for annual funds. As you know, there are multiple types of funds that we can use to fund our projects. I would like to talk about the other two. We already talked about annual funds. Now let's talk about multi-year funds. Multiple multi-year funds are available for obligation by the customer in excess of 1 fiscal year, but only for a defined period of time. Typically, we see them in 2-year periods. So, for example, you may have 23, 24 funds or 24 or 25 funds. Before I skip on to show you the visualization for that, I would just like to talk about no-year funds. So no-year funds are not bound by fiscal year limitations, and the customer may obligate them at any time. And the funds are available until expense. So let's go back to our period of availability example with the IRS. So IRS now, this project is funding with this project with multi-year fund 23-24 funds. That would extend, let's pretend that will change where the red line is to the end of fiscal year 24, because they're able to be obligated. They're able to be obligated until the end of fiscal year 24 to fund your project. And then you'll have one additional year to liquidate those funds. So you would have until the end of fiscal year 30 to liquidate the funds, one extra year to be able to liquidate the funds. Okay, so now that we've talked about period of availability, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Beth to speak to you about the National Policy Manual and other RWA policy details. So Laura Beth.
Thank you, Paige. All right, so now that Paige has went over the basics and the main laws that govern GSA and why we do what we do, she kind of explained the appropriations here. Let's dig a little further into our GSA RWA National Policy Manual. That's going to go a little bit further into this and more laws that we have to follow and our processes of what we go through. So with that said, let's go to the next page slide. All right, thanks, Paige. All right, so as I mentioned, we have our GSA RWA National Policy Manual. It is located on our external website that you guys can access at gsa.gov/RWA. What I want to highlight here is actually there's some changes coming. So we have a new version of this particular policy coming out this summer. And with this version, there's a lot of changes, but I've kind of keyed here some of the important changes that will actually affect your agency coming out. So the first is our new policy will actually expand the use of multiple buildings. Currently, our policy allows the expanded use of multiple buildings, but only for what we call an N-type RWA that we do. The new policy will extend it to we can do it for the A's and B's. Now, like I said, it's going to be the same restrictions, though. I just wanted to point that out. We can allow multiple buildings on an RWA, but it has to meet certain stipulations. And all of that is located out in this policy manual. Another one is we revised the definition of the word incidental when it comes to furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So as you know, sometimes we can do furniture for you guys. We have redefined that word of incidental in here, and we actually have a slide on it, a few more down. So I'm not going to get into great details on this one. We also, for the next one, removed the 10% or $500 rule. While it's been removed, we actually already have it in effect. I want to make sure I put that out there. So basically what it was is if the RWA went over 10% or $500, whichever is less, an amendment was not required on the RWA as long as your agency paid the bill. Well, that rule has been taken out. So even if your RWA goes over by $1, an amendment is necessary in order to collect those funds from you. We also included some clarity on the RWA management fee for non-reoccurring RWAs with an authorized amount below $2,000. Again, we have a few more slides down here. We're going to kind of talk about the fees, but in this case, what it's really meaning is if you have an RWA you brought in for $2,000 or less, we normally only bill off of expenses. But if it meets this criteria, the full amount of the fee will be incurred on the first billing. So that's a change that we have going on there. And then the last is the allowance of using a bid and or proposal to support that cost of that RWA that you're sending into us is permissible for the new RWAs. Currently in this policy, it's usable if you're doing an amendment, which is quite common there with, you know, the bids coming in higher and stuff. We need more money to complete the work for you. This will actually allow it to use that type of documentation for a new RWA. Is it a common occurrence? No, it's very rare, but it does happen in a few circumstances. So if we actually have that bid, why not be able to use that bid to support those costs? All right, so we've gone through those. Now let's kind of jump into a little bit more of the meat of this policy manual that we have. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Paige. Let's start off by talking about antecedent liabilities as defined in our policy manual. So what is an antecedent liability? An antecedent liabilities definition is basically for when costs have arisen for unforeseen conditions. When we do projects for you guys, that it's common occurrence, especially if it's, construction projects and stuff that take a long time to do. Costs could go up, we could do different stuff. So it's an unforeseen condition, and it's considered an antecedent liability because basically the scope stays the same, but the additional work is necessary to complete that desired outcome that your agency has requested of us. So that is what we call an antecedent liability. And kind of like I was saying before, your examples or your material costs have increased. Your bid came in higher than anticipated. Your unknowns out there, like maybe there was duct work that did not show up on the drawings that we did, and that duct must be moved in order to accomplish that desired outcome that you guys have requested. Those are the additional what we would call an antecedent liability. You're getting the same scope of work, but we've got to do the C part. We've got to do the C part along with the A and B in order to get that desired outcome that you were wanting. So like I said, these are great examples of antecedent liabilities out there, and antecedent liabilities will require an amendment. However, it is important to note that new scope cannot be added to an RWA past the fiscal year of acceptance, as new scope is not an antecedent liability. We've seen it quite a few times come through, and let me give you an example. So maybe you have submitted in an RWA just for a small renovation. You want to recarpet a certain room. So as we're progressing through the RWA, recarpeting this room or something, you decided, well, this carpet looks great, but it just doesn't go with the walls. We want to repaint the walls too. So if that RWA is past the fiscal year of acceptance, that is what's considered new scope and cannot be added on there. You would have to submit in an actual new RWA in order to actually perform those services. Let's go to the next slide, please, Paige. Let's go a little more in some more appropriations law here, which is, incrementally funding versus full funding here. So what are we talking about? Incremental funding is basically funding a project over time, which is strictly prohibited by appropriations law. We cannot fund that project over a period of time. So an example would be, so maybe GSA has come back and gave you the bid on a project, and it's going to cost you $1 million to actually perform this construction that you're wanting. And maybe your agency only has $600,000 to be able to fund it right now. And you come to us and say, hey, we got $600,000. Can you go ahead and proceed with this project? And then next fiscal year, when we get more money, we'll send you in the remaining $400,000 to actually cover the project. That is a no-go. That is what is considered incremental funding and is actually strictly prohibited by appropriations law. So GSA cannot do that for you. The project must be fully funded, which brings us in the fully funding part. It's another thing that is required from appropriations law we have out there. The government, in appropriations law, basically, GSA cannot knowingly enter into a contract knowing there is not enough funding to complete the contract. So this goes on to the full funding and the incremental funding part of it. You must have a complete scope and provide funding for that entire identified project that you send in there. And I'm going to use another example, and I'm using easy examples here. Just another carpet and paint example. So maybe you submit in an RWA and your desired outcome is carpet and painting of that room. And we do the estimate for you, but then when you fund it, you only fund the carpeting portion and not the paint portion. Well, that is not fully funding the project there. So you either have to de-scope and take off the paint portion, or you have to send in those additional funds to cover both the carpet and paint. Whatever you have identified in that scope of work, we have to collect and fund to get that done for you. All right, so let's go to the next slide, please, page. And you remember when I was going through the changes coming out in the new latest policy coming in 2023, we have defined the definition of incidental when it comes to furniture and limited personal property to provide for you agencies. So as many of you guys know, FAST, who is our sister organization, is actually the one that handles pretty much all the personal property, the furniture, and everything else. However, in certain circumstances, PBS is allowed to do the furniture portion and limited personal property for your agency. And it can only be done when it's incidental to a project we are currently working. So maybe we are doing a huge build out for you and it's taking multiple years and you want the furniture portion supplied with that project. That's great. We can do it as long as we make it incidental to the project. So question here is, what do we mean by incidental? How do we define incidental? We have defined incidental as receiving that RWA for the furniture prior to the awarding of the general contractor's contract or the lease award. So as long as we get that RWA for the furniture portion prior to us actually awarding that construction or signing that lease award, it creates it incidental to the project. After that, it's what would be considered a standalone. So GS or PBS can do a certain portion of limited standalone furniture past that point, but it's very very small wise. There's a lot of restrictions against it for PBS to do. Personal property wise, there are no options. If it's past the period to make it incidental to the project and it's considered standalone, PBS can't do it. Your best bet is to go to our sister organization, FAST, who would be able and love to help you accomplish that work. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. Let's go to the next slide, please, page. And now we are going to talk about severable versus non-severable. This is another portion of our policy that is very, very confusing. So we're hoping to kind of separate that out for some people for a better understanding. Severable and non-severable is very important to understand because they also have different restrictions out there. So let's talk severable real fast. What do I mean by severable? Well, severable, consider it like this. It's a benefit that is received each time a service is rendered. So that's basically, your overtime utilities, your cleaning, those above standard services. Every time they're rendered, you are receiving a benefit each time. Therefore, that is what is considered a severable project. Why do we have to separate out severable? Because there's different restrictions in appropriations law on how you handle severable services. One of the main restrictions is severable services cannot exceed a 12-month period of time. So, if your agency comes to us and say, hey, I want to pay overtime utilities for the next 2 years, say, or whatever, that is something that GSA could not accommodate because that exceeds that 12-month period timeline. On your non-severable, that's a different subject here. Your non-severable, basically your project. So the benefit is only received for you when the entire project is complete. Those are mainly our construction projects we do for you guys that could exceed multiple fiscal years. There's a single outcome to it. The execution for that particular project can be within the funding liquidation period, which means it's not confined to the 12-month period. It could take us 1, 2, 3 years to actually complete that project. You remember when Paige was kind of go over the different types of appropriation, your annual, your multi-year, and no year? Those are important for us to understand because whatever your agency funds with tells GSA how much time that we have to actually liquidate that project for you. So like I said, it's your construction projects, your carpeting and repainting a room. If you've asked us to, carpet an entire room, but, we go in and only carpet half the room, you have no benefit until the entire room is carpeted. So that's why it's a single outcome and you only get that benefit once everything is complete. All right, so let's flip to the next slide, Peach. To the next slide, please, Paige. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. All right, so, okay, we just talked about severable and non-severable. Now let's break this down a little bit further by the types of RWAs that GSA might use. So I'm saying types here. GSA is actually the one that will sign the types, but this is good information for you guys to know on how we come up with what the types are and what they actually mean to you. GSA will, once you guys submit in a work request, GSA will start working with you on that particular work request. And during that process time, with help of your agency, is how we will determine the best type to put this RWA under. So this first slide here, we've also separated this into severable and non-severable in the types within. Some can cross, but we'll go through that here in a second. So our R type is our reoccurring RWA. It is your severable services. It is only good for that 12-month life cycle, and it is only good for the fiscal year. So it can go from October 1st to September 30th. Now you're not restricted to that 12-month period, which means it can only be, if you only need the duration for 3-4 months, you can do that on an R type. It just has to be within the fiscal year, and you cannot cross fiscal years with it. So, and like I said, it's tied to that single fiscal year. So let's talk N types for a second. N types are used sometimes for our severable services. These are when our costs are readily identifiable. We can, we have a contract. We know exactly how much is going to go against it and stuff. This is when we're going to use an N type to perform that severable service. Again, you're restricted to your 12 months. However, N types will actually be allowed to cross fiscal years. So it doesn't have to run the October through the September life cycle. It could be, April 1st through March 31st. And it can also be for that shorter time frame. It just cannot exceed the 12 months. So again, if you need 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, whatever it is out there, it can be done on this N type. So, like I said, on these, your services are separately identified, and so your costs are known, which is why we would put it as an N type. I want to note here, though, because the N type is a type, we're going to see it again on the next slide under non-severable, that we can use for severable and non-severable. So I just want to make a notation here. It's important to know that when we do take RWAs in, we cannot mix severable services with non-severable services on the same RWA. Why is that? Because of all these restrictions that I just kind of briefly went over with you regarding your severable and stuff, they're more restrictive, so it's not allowed to have them on the same RWA to be on the safe side on stuff. So I'm sorry here, I'm about to lose my voice. Let's go. Paige, can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so let's dig a little further in the types, and let's talk about the non-severable RWA types or non-reoccurring RWAs. So again, we have the N type. Like I said, your N type can be severable or it can be non-severable. We use the N type if it's a standalone project. It's a one-time need, non-prospective space alteration project. That is when, if we're talking non-severable side of the house, is when we would use the N type RWA to accommodate the project that your agency has requested. A types are similar to the N, but we will use this and assign it an A type number if it's associated with GSA funding. So if maybe GSA is doing a portion of the project and your agency is submitting in additional funds for the project, that is when we are going to use the A type number. That helps to distinguish to us, okay, we have this number here that's telling us it's not only customer funding coming through, but we also have GSA funding working with it. The other type that we could use is your B type. GSA will assign a B type number anytime it's related to a prospectus project, and that is regardless of the RWA value. So your RWA, you send in maybe maybe will be on for only $100,000. That's lower than prospectus limitations. But if it is associated with prospectus product that we're doing, then it'll get assigned a B type number. That way it's easily identifiable to us. Hey, we got this B type number. Okay, we've got a prospectus project going on. It's a correspondence with that moving through the system. All right, let's flip to the next slide, please, Paige. Now we're going to talk about our F types. F types get their own little slide because these are special little guys here. And I just want to make sure that we spend a little bit more time on them. F type is really the only type that your agency might work with GSA on, saying, hey, I want this F type as long as it meets certain restrictions. And why? Because it's for the miscellaneous work. They are only good from October 1st through September 30th. So they are literally only valid through the period availability of your funding, which makes them a less risk to GSA. So they don't have as many requirements behind them in documentational purposes, like your N, A's, B's, and all those other types out there. So F types, like I said, are for that miscellaneous work. They're great to have out there. Just, maybe your agency sends one at the beginning of the year for $10,000 and for those as needed little miscellaneous repairs. You've already got the funding. So if you walk into work one day and maybe your door handle broke, you got the funding on the books with GSA to immediately order it. And that way GSA can get that work done faster for you and actually have an RWA on the books to charge. Like I said, they're less restrictive, but there are some limitations behind an F-type RWA. Your biggest restriction is your limitations here. So an authorized amount of an RWA cannot exceed $250,000. A single purchase cannot exceed $25,000. So as long as you are going below those items, you'll be fine with the limitations. But it's important to note too, your other restrictions, like I said, you're only good for a year. It's gonna automatically close on September 30th. And so everything has to be done by September 30th. And I mean everything. So your execution of work, the payments that GSA makes to the vendors, the billing to you guys, the reimbursement, all that has to be done prior to September 30th on an F-type RWA. So I just want to make sure that we had those little caveats out there. That might be great, less restrictive, but there's a couple more loopholes with those bad boy F types there. All right, so now that I went through there, I'm going to grab a drink of water and try to get my voice back, and I'm going to turn it back over to Paige, who's actually going to start going over the system with you, E-Rita and Rita. Take it away, Paige.
Thanks, Laura Beth. Rita, E-Rita, what's the difference? Actually, that's the trick question. It's the same system, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. So RITA stands for the RWA entry and tracking application. E-RITA simply stands for external RWA entry and tracking applications. So they're really the same system, but they have two different logins because internal GSA users will log in through one portal, and new GSA's customers log in through the PBS extranet portal. So what is RITA? RITA is how you submit your work requests. You're using it to submit the electronic 2957, but it also contains customer letters, automated communications, documentation for any pertinent work requests or RWAs that your agency has completed with us. And then it also has years of history of the RWAs that has been sent in by your agency. Now, isn't that cool? It's really a repository of lots of cool information. To me, RITA really is a data powerhouse. However, you as the customer are limited by the AB code, which are on your user profile. And GSA is limited in editing by the GSA region in which the user sits in. And you as the customer only have a few extra buttons that are different than GSA. So now that you have a better understanding of RITA and eRITA and the difference, how do you want to get access? So to get access to eRITA, if you don't have it already, you'll want to navigate your portal, your web browser to gsa.gov/eRITA. You want to navigate to the left-hand side in the red box there and click on the link, how do I access eRITA? On this page, you will be guided through how to select your AB code, how to fill out the digital, the online or the manual application, and then submit it to eRITA at gsa.gov. And then you'll receive your access within 1 to 2 business days. So in order to gain access to eRITA, you'll receive an email then from the PBS NAH, the National Application Help Desk. And you'll actually probably want to save this email because it has a lot of quick tips on how to fix your access if you're having issues, but also it has the link to the extranet portal. So in addition to gaining access on our website, we also have lots of trainings that are available, frequently asked questions, and quick resources guides that can be helpful to you as you're looking to use eRITA to submit your work requests and RWAs. But you might also want to attend our upcoming training session on eRITA on June 6th. I know the CES team will be giving more information at the end of this session today in regards to this training, or you could go online to the CES website and sign up there. So now that we've talked about eRITA access, let's move on to some of the most common acronyms you hear in RWA land. Oops, how do I get back? Hold on a minute. Skipping my head in my slides there. Okay, so let's talk about WR, or work requests, or RWA. So what is the difference? A work request is the identification of a potential need for a project or service. This is the initial request that you're going to input into eRITA, when you identify a need that your agency has. It is initially identified with a W followed by a 7-digit number. So what it does is it's kind of a placeholder. The W is a placeholder, which will eventually be replaced with the type that Laura Beth discussed earlier, an N and R. Those will be assigned when it becomes an RWA. So the work request does not need funding attached, and the RWA rules do not apply because it has not yet become a formal contract. So that's the main difference between the work request and the RWA. Let's move on to the RWA now. The reimbursable work authorization is the actual formal contract between GSA and the customer agency detailing the work that we will perform. The same 7-digit number plus the letter that Laura Beth discussed earlier will be attached and follow the project forever. So the RWA is the formal interagency agreement stating that GSA will provide the goods or service and the customers will be reimbursing GSA for those costs. This requires funding, and it must follow RWA policy and appropriation law. So now that we've gone over the details, I'd like to brainwash you for a second, as a colleague of mine likes to say in her eRITA Digest trainings. I'd like to brainwash you for a second, and please repeat with me. A work request does not equal an RWA. A work request does not equal an RWA. Okay, let's move on. Next, we're going to talk about the RWA workflow. So this process and this chart right here is actually very similar to the RWA tracker, also kind of known to us as our Dominoes tracker that appears in eRITA. It details all the statuses, the different statuses that a work request changes to in eRITA before it becomes an RWA and is a fully fledged and accepted project. So when you initially identify a service or a need that your agency has, you will want to enter it into eRITA. when you save the work request in eRETA, it goes into the pre-planning status. That means you haven't sent it to us yet. So once you have filled out the initial information and you click the Send to GSA button, it goes into the unassigned status. That means that GSA has not yet assigned a PM to it. You will then receive an email that kind of looks like this. Well, kind of, it will look like this. Within 5 business days, you should receive an automated email stating that GSA has assigned a PM to your work request. Now, this is really important. This is when it enters the planning estimate status. After the PM has been assigned, you want to work with that PM to develop the requirements necessary for the project or service. Eventually, the PM will create an estimate in the system and link it to your work request. And that's when it will enter the planning estimate status. And you should receive another email stating that an estimate has been linked to your project. And you should be prompted to log into RETA and check the cost of the project or service you wish to have. So if you choose to accept the estimate, at this point, you're still in the planning estimate status. You will enter any remaining financial information, funding information, and send the work request to GSA for potential acceptance. At this point, GSA may take up to 15 business days to review before routing for signatures. Once GSA has completed its review, the work request enters a pending new status where GSA reviews and enters GSA-specific information. Once that has been completed, GSA routes the work request for signatures. Both GSA and you, the customer, will digitally sign the RWA via DocuSign, and then your work request becomes a fully fledged and accepted project. It is now an RWA. So with that, we will turn it back over to the CES team.
That's right. Thank you very much. We have thrown a lot of information at everyone, and we want to do a quick knowledge check. But to avoid getting everyone's brains a little too mushy, we made this one a true or false question, and the answer was given just in the past couple of slides. So we want to know, true or false, a work request is a formal agreement between PBS and a customer. True or false? I think if you are one of those eRETA users from earlier in the poll, I hope that you would know the answer to this question. Or if you were just simply paying attention to the slides and what our presenters were saying. So give everyone just a few seconds here. And then we will await the results, and then I'll turn it back over. All right, so we have 19% who say it is true. We have 81% who say it is false. I am a host and not a subject matter expert, so I am going to turn it back over to Paige to reveal the answer and why.
So thanks, Eric. So those that answered false were correct. A work request, as I stated before, is not a formal agreement between PBS and the customer. Once the work request has been signed and accepted by both the agency and the GSA, it becomes that official interagency agreement, or the RWA. So the answer to this is false. The work request is not a formal agreement between PBS and a customer, but an RWA is a formal request. So with that, we will go back to our presentation, and I would like to turn it over to Laura Beth for requirements development.
All right, thank you, Paige. All right, so we went over some rules and policy. We went over, the work request and submitted them in. So now this gets to the fun part. This is okay, you've sent us a work request. What's gonna go on now with GSA? How do we get this work request turned into an RWA? Let's go through that now on the steps and processes that GSA takes in order to get there, and some important notes along the way that helps GSA to do a better job in getting these back to you. So with that said, requirements development is the number one thing. You know, your agency has submitted in that work request and GSA has responded back, hey, we've made assignment. It's been assigned to this certain GSA PM. It's in that email sent to you. That person would be then reaching back out to you and do what we call the needs interview, you know. And it's just basically a meeting to, for you guys to work together and to develop that scope, that desired outcome that your agency is wanting, that schedule, that budget, all that information in there, that's what they're going to work for and trying to get this for you. They're going to, along this process of, trying to get to your desired outcome, ensuring that compliance with fiscal law, policy, and ABAS is out there. ABAS is basically the disability statutes that we have to follow. So they're just going to make sure along the way that we are following the A, B, and C to get it for you accurately. Like I said, this is a joint venture, though, between the GSA PM and you guys as our customers, your POC. All right, so let's flip to the next slide here. And we're going to talk about the scope development part of it. It is a key part of it, and I will go into more here why it's key. But it is during this time, you've kind of said, okay, here it is, but you're going to further define that scope. You're going to assist us with better accuracy in developing those estimate numbers for you. That is a key point here. So as Paige had kind of indicated at the beginning, you need your intent, your content, and your extent to it. Again, what was the intent? The intent is that purpose, that objective. That is what's going to come out of that needs interview of the requirement developments that we just talked about. What are we doing for you? What is that desired outcome? What is your intent with this work request that you've submitted into GSA to actually perform? That is the intent of the project. Your content is, how do we receive that? How do we achieve that desired outcome for you? Do we have to do a design? Will it require replacement of carpet or something? The content is what helps us to be more accurate in the estimation portion of it too. So we need to know, exactly, you want this desired outcome. Well, here's all these key little factors that need to get done to give you that desired outcome. We have to know your extent too. How much are we providing and where? So this is going to include your building location, what rooms are involved, or in those cases where we're doing a new space build out for you guys, the square footage, because on those, it's basically the square footage is all we have, along with your agency's program of requirements. So those are a little vaguer, but we've got to have the extent. We have to have the parameters around that project that we're going to work on. So again, once that is defined, we'll use that defined scope to develop the independent government estimate for you. The better defined, the better estimate we're going to get for you. It's probably going to be more closer to the dollars and not have, like, oh, sorry, we need $100,000 more dollars to do this project. The defined scope is what helps us to be able to do that. And I wanted to add a little reminder in here on this slide too. A reminder of the appropriations law that Paige went through at the beginning, the use of funds. You cannot use an RWA for scope that was not defined on that RWA. I wanted to reiterate this here because it has been asked before, but just ensure whatever you are wanting done needs to be in that scope of work that's coming through. All right. We've talked about the requirements development and, your scope development. Let's flip to the next slide here, Paige. And let's go a little bit further into the GSA cost estimate part of it. So we have already created the IGE, or what is considered the independent government estimate, to actually, okay, here are your estimated construction costs. What the GSA PM will do then is use those and plug them into our system to create the cost estimate for you. Now, I do have it separated here. There are actually two cost estimates that can be done in the system. One's an SCE, your summary cost estimate, and the other's an OUE. It's your overtime utility estimates. I wanted to include those both in here because they're both, two types of RWAs, whether you're doing a severable project or you're doing a non-severable project. But let's just start here with the SCE. We use these to be able to summarize and get all those costs on that project for you and give you an accurate estimate of, hey, if you want to do this right here, it's going to cost you $100,000 to submit it. So the summary cost estimate in RETA allows us to, put the estimated construction costs, or what we call the ECCA, from the independent government estimate into the system. It allows us to put a contingency on there for the unknowns. Very important to have a contingency, especially it helps to not delay project if an unforeseen condition comes up. It has the design on there for us. There's CM&I services. FF&E, if there's any furniture or anything, it's going to be all identified on this. I do have this in a couple more slides and we'll go through there and I'll kind of show you where they're at, but it's important to note, this is kind of what summarizes everything that GSA is doing up in one, because and also I forgot to tell you, put your GSA fees on there. Your OUE estimate, like I said, is your overtime utilities. We'll create that and use that for all those above standard costs. So your overtime utilities, your janitorial services, your preventive maintenance and stuff, those are going to be what's on an OUE estimate, which is different than a summary cost estimate because it's a different format. It's your overtime utilities. So you have kilowatts and everything else out there saying, this is how GSA figure out those costs for you. All right, let's flip to the next slide, please. And now we're going to talk about GSA labor and travel direct charging. So we have this separated out there. It could be on there. It's going to be identified on your summary cost estimate, which is direct charging. So what does this mean to you? What is direct charging? Anytime GSA is actually performing the work on that particular RWA for you, it's what we consider direct labor, meaning that person, whether they're doing your design or your performing the CM&I services, stuff like that, if they are physically doing it, they will be charging their time to the RWA. And so that's what we call direct charging. It is a direct cost to the RWA. It is for everything that's not covered by the RWA and by the other RWA management fee that we have, and we'll go more into that one in the next slide. But like I said, direct charging, if GSA is doing those costs, we are required to actually put our labor on there. GSA is not in the business to make a profit, but we are in the business to, have a wash at the end. So let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about our RWA fees, which is what we consider the indirect costs. This covers the non-business line overheads of everything that we do for your agency. We have two different fee structure. We have a flat fee and we have what's called the RWA management fee. Your flat fee is for your reoccurring severable RWAs. It's a flat fee, $500. That's it. No more, no less being charged to it. So even if you're ordering $250 worth of overtime utilities, it's a flat fee of $500. Like I said, it's on your severable projects. That entire fee is charged on the first billing cycle when it comes through. Because the way that those RWAs bill is it takes the service period requested, whether it's a year, 6 months, 3 months, or whatever, divides the amount out. And that's what you're billed monthly, along with automatically putting that fee on the first billing that goes out. Now, it's important to notate on these that for those type of RWAs using the flat fee structure, they can only be refunded if the RWA is canceled and no costs were incurred. So it can only happen if we have actually, not incurred any of those costs, then it can be canceled and refunded back. Now, your RWA management fee is going to cover the non-recurring, non-severable projects we have out there, everything else. Again, It is the non-business line overhead cost that it is designed to incorporate, because again, GSA, it cannot make a profit, but we do have to, at least come even with what we do. I'm sorry, I can't think of the word there. But okay, so you have your non-business line overhead with your RWA management fee. This fee is actually a stepped fee structure. So it has a floor, but no ceiling. Again, your minimum on this is $500, but it can go up to whatever the amount, depending on the step fee structure there. So it applies to all the costs on the summary cost estimate, with the exception of the purchase of personal property. It's important to notate that here. On the purchase of personal property, that is not subject to the RWA management fee, and that is the only thing that would not be subject to the RWA management fee. And in the case of the RWA management fee, it is billed based on your expenses. So as expenses occur on the project that we are doing for your agency is when the billings will occur. Minus at the beginning, the little caveat I was telling you, the new portion coming out is if the RWA is for 2,000 or less, it is automatically going to bill it on that first billing cycle to you. So those are kind of our fees. And we talked about direct labor, and again, why we have to do it, and everything else on here. Let's go to the next slide, please, Paige. Let's go have some more fun here. We're going to dig a little further. So once all that is complete and GSA has created the summary cost estimate or the overtime utilities, and they've actually approved it in the system will automatically email your agency's POC, whoever was identified on it when you submitted in the work request, that, hey, GSA has done this. GSA has done the estimate. Here's the estimate. It's just a letter letting you know that, okay, GSA has went through all their steps. This is how much it's going to cost to do the project that you are requesting. So basically what this is, it's your trigger to fund the project if you would like to proceed moving forward. There are some instances where maybe it came in way higher and your agency decided, hey, we're not even going to proceed with this project. That's great. Just go into the system and make sure you cancel that work request and get it out of the system. But other than that, when they go through, this is the trigger, for you to send it over to your finance people to get that funding added, and you get that proper, whatever you guys need to do on your side to get it submitted over so we can turn that work request into an RWA for you. All right, so let's go to the next slide, please, Paige. Like I said, I had it broken out. I actually have, this is a copy of a summary cost estimate. So this is a non-severable project, non-reoccurring. This is a copy of the estimate that would come in the email to you guys that you would actually see. I wanted to have this in here so I can actually kind of go through it and actually, explain what some of this means. So if you can see in the top part, your ECCA, that was the estimated construction cost for this particular project. So that's basically what was on the IGE that we got in, or that we created when we were trying to accept the project, saying, hey, here's your desired outcome. Here's all the content that needs to go into it to be able to do it. We have our limitations on there and everything. We want to proceed. It's going to, just to do this part alone, it's going to be $384,183. That is what that's telling you. Step 2 there is we can add on a construction contingency. Like I said before, a construction contingency is a very good thing to add on there to help with the unknowns. And especially if you're doing a major project, because it will help prevent stoppage of the project. Maybe something happened, we have nothing there and we need to amend the RWA. We're having to wait for that amendment to come through before we can proceed with the contract to actually finish the work. So contingency kind of helps to offset some of that stuff. This is where the design services and your CM&I services will be identified here on this first page of that summary cost estimate. So Usually if it's percentage, it means the GSA will contract out for those services. Sometimes there'll be a flat amount. If it's a flat amount, usually that means that either it's a pre-negotiated amount with a lessor, or it may be direct labor. So somebody in GSA is actually going to be funding those costs for you. But those are basically where you can see those costs separated out of what it's going to cost in design and what it's going to cost in your CM&I services. So let's go to page 2 of this bad boy here, the summary cost estimate. This digs into it even further. Additional, if there was a move part of this project, those costs will be identified here. For your direct labor and all other sources, this is aligned specifically for the direct labor, so you can see the GSA direct labor on there. Again, this is where it's going to access the RWA fees to it. In this case, it is an RWA management fee. And so total for this project, it's saying $402,907.81 just in fees alone to cover it. It's going to identify any of the FF&E if you do have any on here, which again is your furniture, fixtures, and equipment. That is below on line 25 because per a few slides ago when I was talking, the furniture, if the purchase of furniture or your purchase of your FF&E, basically, it's not subject to the RWA management fee. That's why we have it below, because it's not going to be incorporated in that number to get a fee charged onto it. So in this case, if you would have any of those costs, then it would be saves 25,000 and be on there, and that 25,000 would be added to the total there so far, 579, 255.38 to give you your new total, because it's not going to put the fees on there. That, so that line 28 gives you the total cost that GSA anticipates to complete this project for you, to give you the desired outcome, whatever you guys are looking for in those construction, that's what that total amount is. What I want to highlight here is right below that dollar value, you see a little guy called range of accuracy right there. Please note that range of accuracy. That is extremely important, because you remember when we were talking about estimates and knowing what your content was, exactly what you want to know. The better defined scope of work, the better range of accuracy we can give you. The range of accuracy is dependent on the defined scope of work and also the project phase, where we are in the project phase. Because if you're at the early starts budgetary phase of a project, it's going to have a higher range of accuracy because we don't know those known details in there. So if we have more of that known details and we have more of that information, we can lessen that range of accuracy to be able to, give you this cost, say, this is what's going to cost, and not have to come back for an amendment to increase because of an antecedent liability. That's why I wanted to note to pay attention to those range of accuracies out there, because that's basically going to let you know how close GSA thinks we are and what this particular project is going to cost to complete the work for you. All right, so let's flip to the next slide, please, Paige. And here we are going to talk about the actual intake and submission process of the RWAs. So how are work requests submitted to become RWAs? Well, we kind of already went through that. You submitted in a work request. We've gone through, we've, done the scope, done the development, done the estimates, done the IGs, the whole 9 yards. And we've sent you that letter saying, hey, this is what it's going to cost. So once your agency goes into the system and actually funds that remaining cost out there, and you submit it back to GSA, that's where we're on the tracks to start getting to this work request into an RWA. This is how we start that process. We need the funding from you guys. That is what we call a submitted RWA. Well, you have submitted the funding. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. But anyway, so what to expect after you submitted the funding to GSA? First of all, GSA still has little steps and loopholes that we have to go through. It's anticipated average for GSA from when you guys send to GSA for acceptance is a 15-day process. Do we always hit the 15-day mark? No, we do not. You always have your caveats out there. It depends on the complexity of the project, the dollar value. Any one of those, if it's complex project with a high dollar value, could extend out how long it's going to take us. But most, and I mean most of the time, this is done within a 15 business day period by GSA. At least that's our goal, to get these through. So it is during this time frame that we're going to go through and we're going to ensure that the proper documentation is present to support that RWA. I know we've got some customer finance people out there. You guys know as well as we know that we've got to ensure that proper documentation is there in case the RWA hits an audit, because we have to explain to the auditors why we did what we did. So we're going to use this time frame to ensure that that proper documentation is out there. We have the IGE to support the costs, why we took in the amount we did. Stuff to support a bona fide need, stuff to support the scope that you have on there and stuff. All that stuff, we are going to ensure that we have that proper documentation to support the RWA. It is also during this time that it'll go through a GSA internal review process. Type of review process it goes through is really dependent on the dollar value. So as you can imagine, the higher the dollar value, the more reviews it's going to get, basically, especially a prospectus project. Prospectus have to go through a whole hierarchy approval process. So again, like I said, we shoot for 15 business days, but if you're dealing with prospectus project, and maybe it's not only prospectus, but it's a really complex project, probably not going to make the 15 business days. We will try, but we're probably not going to do it. So once we get through all that, and it's went through a review process, we ensure the proper documentation is there. This RWA is ready to move forward, or this work request is ready to move forward to become an RWA. GSA will route it for signatures then. All right, it's going to be sent first to you guys as our customer, and it's sent via an email where you guys can go into the email, click the link, and actually sign on the RWA. So what does that mean? You do not have to have access to eRead to sign the RWA. All you have to do is have an email account. That's what works. Because, like I said, DocuSign is going to submit it to your email, where in that email will be a specific link that you can click on and actually, apply that digital signature to the RWA. So once you have accomplished that, this DocuSign will then turn it back to GSA and send it to our GSA approving official for them to do the same thing. Again, they don't have to have access to the system. They just will get the email, they'll click on the link, and they'll say digitally sign RWA. Let's go. Let's move forward with that. So super easy to do. It's so easy, it can even be done by a smartphone. It doesn't have to be on a computer, but like I said, it's through that email. So once you have that said and done, and so we've got both signatures on there, woohoo, we're ready to go. The system at that point will automatically send you guys an acceptance letter. It's going to go to the POCs that are identified in that work request or now RWA in the system. So once you get that letter, that letter initiates to you guys, first of all, to actually make that obligation on your books. I'm sorry, I almost forgot to say that. I want to make sure I put that on there. But it gives GSA the green light to start the execution process for the project. Get you that desired outcome. Let's get this done and get it all out there for you. All right, so let's switch to the next slide, please, Paige. All right, so we've talked about signatures. Kind of wanted to go through this a little bit more because when we first started using this in DocuSign, we had some issues with emails not showing up. It's not really a huge issue now, but I still want to leave it here because it's good information to have. So, like I said, the email is routed to you guys as our customer first, and then it comes back to GSA. There have been times when you guys have come to us saying, hey, I know you've said you've sent this for signature. The system showing it was sent for signature, but I never got an email. The first thing you really need to do is check your spam folder. 9 times out of 10 at the beginning, that's where the email ended up going, was to the spam folder. But if you have checked your spam folder and it's still not there, don't hesitate. GSA, we can still, cancel, abandon the signature and resend it out to you guys. So it would be a new email coming out to you. The other thing that you can do to help, if you do have the trouble issue of it going into your spam folder, is we have email addresses up here on this bottom right. Add these email addresses into your contacts, because usually that's where the emails are coming for, those particular addresses. So if you have them added into your contacts, it's less likely that the system is going to throw it into your spam folder, because it's going to say, hey, these people, okay, we're going to let this one go through. So this is just good troubleshoot ideas for you guys, should you run into those issues. But like I said, when in doubt, always call the GSA PM identified, your POC on that RWA, who can, help assist you any further on that. All right, so that's the process of doing the new RWAs and getting them accepted. Let's flip to the next slide, please, Paige. And let's go into RWA amendments more. So, what is an RWA amendment? We've already accepted a new RWA amendment. So, anytime that, going back to what Paige said, your RWA is a contract. So, anytime a modification is done, whether it's in changing the scope or increasing the desire or decreasing the funding, amendment is necessary to modify that contract, because it's a contract. We got to make that we've got to do that. So RWA amendments are for when we've already accepted the RWA, but we've got to make some changes for it. It's going to come through what we call an RWA amendment. So we talked about what are amendments, but what are amendments acceptable for? When can we do an amendment? Administrative changes. That's a big one. Anytime administrative changes, that's an acceptable amendment to put through. Changes or additions to the scope of work within the same fiscal year of RWA acceptance. Remember, I think this is probably the third time I've said this. You cannot change the scope of work on the RWA past the fiscal year of acceptance of the original RWA, regardless of your funding source. So you might have sent in an RWA in June, and here we are in November, and you want to add scope, and it's also using the know your fund source, still can't do it. You can only add within. So if you wanted to add that scope, it would have had to have been sent in prior to our deadline date, which we'll go into here in a few more slides. But anywho, that's the only time you can do it. If you're doing a reduction in the scope, or any of your cost increases or changes due to antecedent liabilities, those are all acceptable times when we can amend the RWA. So what's not acceptable is, like we already said, out of scope changes past the fiscal year of acceptance. If those come through, we can't do it. Or if you're talking on the severable side of the house, extensions of the POP dates. Period of performance on those severable RWAs. I misspelled that out for you. I apologize about that. But extending those dates out, because like I said before, severable services, you can't exceed 12 months. They're a little bit sticky can of worms. An amendment to change those performance dates are not allowed. Okay, so we've talked about doing the amendments. What about funding those amendments if it is acceptable amendment to go through? So if we could flip to the next slide, please, Paige. We're going to talk about funding amendments. And I know Paige had kind of referenced this before. This is where we're going to get more the meat of the subject here. So if amending due to antecedent liabilities, how do you fund? Well, appropriations law requires antecedent liabilities to be funded with a funding source that was available to your agency when the bona fide need was established. So when was the bona fide need established? The bona fide need was established when GSA, or when we accepted that original RWA for you. So when we accepted the original RWA for you is when that bona fide need was established. So you guys have come to us with a project, and we've estimated, we accepted as the RWA. That's the fiscal year that your bona fide need starts. However, you do have one caveat on that. If you're talking brand new leases, it is your bona fide need starts when that lease award was started. So that's a little caveat there. So your RWA, that's the bona fide need that was established, and that is the funding source that it should be using. So with that said, maybe we took an RWA in fiscal year 22, and we are now in fiscal year 23, and we have an antecedent liability. The cost of went up. We need additional $10,000 from your agency. A funding source that was available to your agency in 22 is what should be used to fund the antecedent liability. It can be any funding source as long as it was available for new obligational purposes during that time frame. Because you remember we talked about those expiration dates? Those expiration dates are for new obligational purposes. So once the funding expires, you can't use it to fund new obligational purposes, but you can use it to fund antecedent liabilities. That funding will still be there for that. So that is the funding source that your agency should be using. So you could have submitted in with an annual 22, but we're in 23, you need to amend it. Well, you don't have any of the annual left, but maybe you have a know your funding source. You can use that as long as it was available to you in 22 to use. So what happens if maybe you have absolutely no funding available from the fiscal year of 22 to do this, but you need to complete this project? That's still okay, as long as we cross those T's and dot those I's. And by that, I mean, your agency can then go ahead and fund it with a current fiscal year funding source that is available to you now. But they also must sign that statement of further written assurance. That was the statement that Paige had talked about a few slides up and stuff. Basically what that is that's a statement that you guys are certifying that your agency has absolutely no funding left from that time period to fund this antecedent liability. Therefore, you have to use current fiscal year funds to fund the amendment coming through. So those are the only times that we could take it, but that statement of further written assurance has to be signed. All right, so I'm losing my voice again, which means it's time for me to turn this back over to Paige to go through some more of the end product of the RWAs.
Thank you so much, Laura Beth. So now we're going to jump into the end of fiscal year RWA deadlines. So this is some of the information that's probably most sought out by our customers. When are we going to draw the red line and say we no longer accept RWAs for the end of the fiscal year? So the end of year deadlines are important because they help us stick to the process that we've been outlining here for you today. So the deadline is to submit fully executable, non-severable RWAs. But when is it? So for all funding authorities, it is the beginning of September. However, for the Economy Act, it is usually during the month of July. The dates, however, have not yet been determined for fiscal year 23, but we can ensure that they will be very similar to past year fiscal end dates, deadline dates. One asterisk and caveat I want to put in here is that amendments are also now subject to the deadlines, even if it is for an antecedent liability. As I said before, this is really to help us ensure that we're able to follow through on the process that we've been explaining you today to best serve your needs and our own needs as GSA as well. So fully executable RWAs, what does that mean? It means that they have a defined scope of work that has already been reviewed by GSA. You have the appropriate funding, and the estimate has already been reviewed with GSA and accepted in ERITA. And the work request has been sent to GSA through ERITA, meaning the customer has pushed the Send to GSA button. Please remember, a work request entered in eRETA does not mean it has been sent for acceptance as an RWA. You must hit the Send to GSA button for it to be considered for acceptance by the end of year deadline. Now that that has been said, there are one or two exceptions, but they're not readily common. And what will happen in these exceptions is that the RWA or the work request will come through the National Program Office in Central Office and be subject to our review. And it is very limited exceptions to the deadline. One is severable RWAs. They're not subject to the September deadline. Second is things that would be considered health, life, safety, or emergencies. But as I said, GSA Central Office must approve of all RWA, all work requests sent to GSA after the September deadline. So now let's move on to a poll question from our CES team.
Sorry about that. A little trouble getting off mute, but yes, thank you. It is time for another poll question. We just got a lot of very valuable information, not just about the process, but about the upcoming deadlines. And so we want to know, this is true or false, but it's also worded as a question. So we want to know, in order to meet the RWA submission deadline, are signatures required? Let's say that true is yes and false is no in this instance. In order to meet the RWA submission deadline, are signatures required? We'll go with yes or no. And while you are pondering that information, I know the presentation just shared kind of rough dates for those deadlines, similar to where they've been in years past. But we here at PBS do our best to broadcast widely those deadlines and dates and information when that is set. Not holding anyone accountable, but usually that comes out by the end of this month, May. So we will hope to get that out to everyone in good time once those deadlines are set. I'll read the question one more time and then we can swap on over to the answers. In order to meet the RWA submission deadline, are signatures required, yes or no? And let's see what we have determined. All right, overwhelmingly, the results favor true or yes, 82% versus 18%. We got a true false question correct last time around. I'm going to throw it back to our subject matter experts to answer this one, and then we still have a few more slides as we have about 20 minutes left in our session here. So I think I am throwing it back to Paige, so I will take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric. And yes, you are right. Those that answered true, signatures are required in order to meet the RWA submission deadline. The RWA must be signed in order for it to be accepted. So let's go ahead and move on now to substantial completion. So substantial completion is when the space has been declared at the beneficial use of the work. So what that means is beneficial use means that the agency can take occupancy of the space. However, there might still be punch list items that remain. So beneficial occupancy means that the space is usable, but there may still be some things that need completed. You know, simple things like touch up, paint, etc. So those punch list items might remain, but the space and the work are substantially complete. So during this period, the contractors have not yet been paid in full, and GSA sends the substantial completion letter to customers, and customers are instructed to not deobligate funds at this point. So here is an example of the automated communication that you will receive when your project has entered the substantial completion phase. It's letting you know that the space has been, the work has been substantially completed, but you should not deobligate any remaining funds at this time. You will want to deobligate the funds during the next period of the project, and we'll go over that next. So this is just an example of the substantial completion letter that you will receive during the substantial completion phase of the project. So now financial closeout. What does that mean? It means that any punch list items, you know, those paint touch-up that I was talking about, any final touches have been put on the space and it has been executed. The GSA project team has paid the contractors. GSA confirms that all obligations have been invoiced and paid, and customer billing and collections is complete. GSA will also send the closeout letter during the financial closeout phase to the customer, instructing the customer to deobligate any remaining funds. So this is an example of the automated communication you will receive when your project has been financially closed out. As you can see, it lists out the amount and the total obligated amount, as well as any remaining RWA balances that can be deobligated on your books during the financial closeout phase. All right, so now that we have talked about financial closeout, we would like to send it back to the CES team, Eric, for one more poll question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And this question is an indication that we're getting more towards the end of our presentation, but we are always working to fine tune the information that we share with customers. So I ask you to please answer this question honestly, because we want to know, as a result of today's session, how much more comfortable are you with PBS's RWA policies and processes? Please choose the honest answer, because we do have this as a recurring presentation. We're always looking to tweak it however we might, just to make it more valuable to our customers. No, it was a very informative hour and 45 minutes or so far. I hope that you did see some value in it. So we're going to close the poll in just a few seconds. And we will put up the results here. Oh, this is wonderful to see that we have a good deal of people, 40%, who are much more comfortable. We have 50%, half of you, who are somewhat more comfortable, and 9% who are going to need some more support. And those 9% and perhaps the 41% who are much more, or I'm sorry, 50% who are somewhat more, do stay tuned, because I have more information about upcoming e-RITA and RWA presentations that may help elucidate just a little bit more. That's coming up at the end of the presentation. We do have just a few more slides left to go. I'm going to hand it back on over to the RWA team, where they can show you how to find more resources and information that we have available to you, and then I will come back and close it on out here.
Thank you very much, Eric. I actually wanted to take a pause and go back for a second to the last poll question in regards to signatures. Well, I can't get my slides to go back. So signatures are not required for the the work request to be fully executable. So what I'm trying to say is that I was incorrect in saying that signatures were required for GSA to accept your work request by the September deadline. What this means is that the work request should be fully executable, but the signatures will be needed by the end of the fiscal year, by September 30th, in order for us to accept the RWA. So just as a reminder, we only need a fully executable work request by the September deadline, and not yet signatures, but we need the signatures by the end of the fiscal year in order for the project to be able to move forward into the next fiscal year. Okay, with that, as Eric said, I'm going to share some more resources with you. For you, you'll want to save these slides for after this presentation to help you as you're navigating e-RITA and RWA world. So there are a couple important contacts for you to note. First is, for RWA policy and program questions and feedback, you can always contact your RWA manager or we have a mailbox that you can send any questions you may have regarding RWA policy. It is askrwa@gsa.gov. We also have a systems-based mailbox for any e-Rita technical questions or issues that you may be having as you're inputting your project into e-Rita. And that is erita@gsa.gov. Finally, any project-specific questions, you can always contact your GSA project manager or the point of contact on your RWA, as well as there are other contacts listed on this presentation or on this slide for billing questions or vendor code questions. And here we have some good resources on our website that will be helpful for you, such as the eRita RWA customer portal, the policy guidance page. This page you will want to visit by the end of May or early June, where we will have posted our year-end letter. We also have lots of eRita training guides, as well as the National Policy Manual and the Frequently Asked Questions. The Frequently Asked Questions is a plethora of questions that we have gathered over the years in regards to eRita and the RWA program, and we have detailed answers and responses to them. And finally, our contact us page. I also want to put in a plug for the D2D PBS customer dashboard. So the dashboard is a really cool tool. It's available through d2d.gsa.gov report/PBS customer dashboard. You can use this link in the presentation to be able to access it. The dashboard provides information on space managed by PBS, including RWAs, projects, occupancy agreements, rent, and many other things. It is a great resource for the entire PBS portfolio of work for your agency. And finally, the master of all things RWA in your region. We have all these contacts listed for our RWA managers listed on our website on our contact us page. You can reach out to them for any questions specific to your RWAs or any projects that you have ongoing, and they'll be readily available to answer your questions. So now I'd like to turn it back over to the CES team to wrap us up.
Thank you very much. And before closing out, I will reiterate, I think I've seen in the chat that copies of the slides were sent to registered attendees before this from the Client Enrichment Series at gsa.gov email address, and we do follow up with slides as well. And you can find them posted on our website, www.gsa.gov/CES, because those last few slides in particular, just rich with links and contact information and things that you'll absolutely want to have on hand. So as we enter the final few minutes, I want to take a quick minute to thank Paige and Laura Beth for an excellent presentation today. A lot of subject matter covered, and 91% of our attendees somewhat are more informed about the subject matter, which is great early results. And I also want to thank the RWA subject matter experts we have behind the scenes in the Q&A pod. Most of all, I do want to thank all of our customers who attended today. I saw numbers up in the 350s or so that's wonderful that we got such a great amount of people here for a very valuable presentation. As I mentioned earlier, we are collecting all of the questions asked and answered and all of the questions asked and yet to be answered, and we will compile them into a frequently asked questions document, and we'll make that available on our website, www.gsa.gov/CES. That's where we archive presentations, slide decks, FAQs, and accompanying material, in addition to the YouTube link that you can see right there on the slide deck. I mentioned that we have more eRita and more RWA content coming, and you see it right there on your screen. We have on Tuesday, June 6th, the eRita Digest section session, excuse me, and that is basically all things e-reader, how to use the system that we talked about earlier. So I know that about 10% here do not have an e-reader user ID. If you see this presentation and say, you know what, I need one of those, or if you need a refresher course on how to use the system, especially as the end of year deadline comes up, you're going to want to register for that course. And that is again on Tuesday, June 6th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern. And then we have an encore presentation of this RWA policy and process fundamentals, and that's scheduled for later in the month of June. I'm sorry, later in the month of July on Thursday, July 20th, and that'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern as well. Registration open for both of those sessions at www.gsa.gov/CES. And at the bottom, one more time, is our YouTube page where you can watch over 40 different sessions on topics from leasing to pricing, space utilization, and everything that we have been putting out there at your convenience on our YouTube page. So one more time, I want to thank all of our customers. I want to thank Laura, Beth, and Paige. I want to thank the RWA team and my colleagues here in the Client Enrichment Series team working hard behind the scenes. And I do want to remind everyone that the goal of our Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience on workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. One more time from me, Eric Fulton, out of GSA's headquarters office in Washington, D.C. Thank you again for attending our session, and have a wonderful rest of your day.